Hi there, Mr. Mayo here with another practice tip. In this video, we're going to talk about being mindful of what our audience hears. So some of the inspiration for this video came with me working with different types of digital music, so digital audio workstations, and they have different reverb plugins there. And I've been experimenting with where I record, how I record, utilizing those reverbs and things like that. Also, part of the inspiration came from another musician. There's a YouTube channel with a guy named Rob Knopper, who's a percussionist with the Metropolitan Opera, and he recently did a video where he reviewed a type of digital recorder where it has two different receivers, and he placed one near and one far, and you could hear the difference. And he showed how he had to make some slight adjustments as he was playing. So being mindful of what our audience hears is very important, and we'll talk about that in a moment. We know as musicians we should listen to what's coming out of our instrument. We should record ourselves often and listen often so that way we can analyze what we actually sound like. Often we get detuned to what we hear and we think we sound different than what we actually sound like. What we sound like is very important, but we don't always take into consideration what our audience actually hears. So why is this important? Because when we perform, we're performing for that audience, and their interpretation is what truly matters. We practice, rehearse, perform in a series of a lot of different spaces. Some of the rooms are kind of small like this one, where others are very large like a concert hall or a gymnasium. Some of the rooms have a lot of things in them, while others are empty. There's sometimes carpeted floors and curtains, while other spaces might have brick, tile, hardwood, or even wood on the walls. This all affects the reverberation of a room, and it's what we hear when we listen is those reverberation, the sound waves hitting those walls and coming back and hitting the ground and being absorbed by different materials. And a lot of people call this echo, which you've probably heard before. Get it? Echo? Heard before? If that bothers you, we can come back to it. There's a lot of physics at play, but we're not really going to get into that. So I'm now here in a gymnasium, which has a lot of reverb in the room. And you're going to notice as I step back, you're going to hear different forms of reverb, and it's going to echo in a different way. It's important to realize that the distance your audience is at will change exactly how the reverberation is felt. So I'm going to start backing up, and you're going to notice that the detail changes depending on the distance that I am from the camera in this room. So here's more close, a little bit further away, even further, about half chords. A little bit further away, I'm pretty close to the free throw line over here. And the complete opposite side. And I didn't change my volume as I spoke. Now you might have noticed that as I changed my distance, the clarity in what I was saying probably changed because you were hearing different reverberation within the room. And it's important as musicians that we take that in consideration as we're playing. I can remember back in college that my teacher, Dr. Frank Schaefer, was listening to me playing a passage on timpani, and I thought I had a very clear-cut understanding of the passage. But what he told me was he didn't hear clarity in what I was playing. It wasn't very clear. It was two different versions of the exact same performance. So what it was I was on top of the drum hearing exactly what it sounded like. Whereas he was a distance away and it just wasn't as clear over there. And his interpretation was the one that mattered. One, because he was my teacher, but also because he was in the audience perspective. He was on the other side of the room and was listening to that clarity. So I had to open some things up and change a little bit so that way I could make sure that he heard the clarity of what I was playing. Depending on the space we're in, what our audience hears and what we hear may be two completely different things. If we're in a room where the sound doesn't reverb very much, we tend to hear every little detail in the audience. Every articulation, tone, release, breathing, dynamics, the striking of an object for percussion, the plucking of a string, the drawing of a bow, the pressing of a key, any type of element that makes a sound. But if we're in a room where there's a lot of reverberation, the reverberation may hide some details that we want to come through. And this is because the sound waves are bouncing all over the place and really cluttering up the sound. The reverberation hides some of those details. It can make our music lack clarity, which is what's so important to our music performance. So how do we avoid all of this? We have to hear things from the audience perspective and make adjustments. Now, we can always just find somebody who we trust who has a great ear and ask them to listen for clarity. But in today's world, we have technology. I recommend setting up a high-quality recorder a distance away from you in a similar environment to where you're going to be performing your music. Perform your music to the best of your ability and then listen to the recording. Pay attention to your performance in relation to the reverberation of the room. Did you have good tone quality? Were musical elements such as dynamic and articulations apparent? Are your technical passages very clear? If you're in a concert hall or a large room, is your sound reaching the back of the hall? Overall, is there clarity? If not, you may need to make some musical adjustments. So in a room that may have a lot of reverb, you have to make your articulations and dynamics very apparent. It all really just depends on the room. So for articulations, you may have to separate notes a little bit more and make the articulations very apparent, which means you may have to adjust your duration, adjust your weight on those notes as well. In a room with little to no reverb, everything must be super clean because everything is apparent. Every little detail can be heard. It has to be done on purpose. You have to make sure your audience hears every aspect of your tone, dynamics, articulation, musicality, note values, and just overall clarity. You may even have to really focus on the resonance of what you're putting out and make sure that every note has really nice resonance, especially when we have releases. Regardless of which environment you're in, you need to make sure that you take note of your adjustments you need to make. An example of an adjustment might be if there's a staccato passage. So in a room with a lot of reverberation, you might actually have to separate the notes and make it even more spaced out as you're performing. Otherwise, the clarity of that might be muddy and it might not just transfer well to your audience. The performer may have to just space out those notes a little bit more, so that way it transfers to the back of the room. In a more dry environment, you might have to take those staccato notes and just make sure each one of them has that bounce quality to it, that it has a lot of reverb behind it, so that way it also has clarity to the passage. Regardless of what type of room you're in, the dynamics can be relative to the environment you're in, and it really depends on the materials in the room, the shape of the room, all those different aspects. In some environments, dynamics transfer really well, while in others, they have to be a little bit more deliberate. You have to make sure your dynamics reach the back of the room no matter what performance space you're in. If you're in a very small performance space, it's likely that you're going to have to make your softers even soft. You have to experiment with all this. You are allowed to experiment to get the best out of your dynamics. Maybe I should soften up on these puns. In whatever room you're in, the sound must be able to reach the back of that room. You can't be very reserved. You have to be deliberate about everything you want, so that way your audience can hear each nuance, dynamic, articulation, tone, and just overall clarity. So don't just think about what's near you. You need to hear things from an audience perspective and make sure your sound is very clear. So be deliberate, focus on clarity, make sure you have an idea of what your audience needs to hear as you perform the music in relation to your intent and the composer's intent. Make things happen on purpose. It's up to you to make sure your audience hears your full intent in the environment that you're in. Make sure your interpretation comes through clear and seek out clarity. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please subscribe for future videos and don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions. My email is mayo@jeffreymayo.com. Do work and go practice.